Hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from the world. Thank you for being here. My name is Yetmir Yashare and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, the CISO's Roadmap to NIS 2 Compliance, Strategies, Challenges, and Best Practices. We're thrilled to dive into this important topic and even more delighted to be joined by our distinguished speakers, Mr. Graeme Parker and Mr. Deepinder Chabra. Before we get started, I'd like to inform the audience that this session will be recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. And an attestation of webinar completion worth 1 CPD credit will be issued within 1 week to all attendees who participate in at least 60% of the live session. Furthermore, we encourage you to engage throughout by submitting your questions using the Q&A feature in the questions box or the chat box, and we will address as many questions as we can during the Q&A segment in the end. Now, without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Graeme.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much for coming along to the webinar today. Hopefully some of what we tell you will be interesting and useful to you. But I thought a good place to start is both myself and Deepinder maybe should just do some quick introductions so you know who we are. So for me, my name is Graeme Parker. As you may be able to pick up from the accent, I'm based in the UK. Specifically, I live in the northeast of England. Nearest city you might recognise is the city of York. By way of background, I've been in and around information security for a long time, since about the year 2000, basically, and I started life in a more technical role, working with a bank. Actually started in essentially desktop and server support, moved into networking and kind of picked up my interest in security there. I've spent some time with the National Health Service here in the UK as a security manager, looking after a number of different, what we call health trusts, essentially. And I've worked for a number of large consulting and outsourcing firms. And long story short, since 2008, I've basically been running my own consulting company here in the UK, so specialising in helping clients implement standards like ISO 27001, PCI-DSS, obviously compliance to things like GDPR and other legislation. And I also spent some time teaching with PCB, hence why I'm here, as well as conducting audits with an audit body as well. So hopefully some of that experience I'll get to mention as we go through the discussion, but what I'll do now, I'll hand over to Deepinder, let Deepinder also do an introduction before we get started.
Thank you very much, Graeme, and good afternoon, good morning, and good day, because we have a very wide audience. So welcome to this webinar, and first of all, huge thank you to PECB, Yetmir and Graeme for inviting me to take part in today's session. It is a great privilege to be here and contribute to this timely and important conversation. As for me, call me Deep. I'm known as Deep, and I have been in information security or cybersecurity for the last more than 20 years. Worked with Xerox, responsible for their risk management across EMEA, India, Turkey, and Russia. And then worked with Airbus and have them set up their global ICT risk management function. And for the last 15 years, I've been working with Verizon, where I have been a principal consultant, and then and luckily and fortunately promoted to be associate director. Relevant to this topic, over the last 18 months, I've had opportunity, I would say rather privilege, to work with diverse set of customers navigating their journey towards compliance, both with NIS 2 Directive and DORA, and that experience has been incredibly valuable. It has given me first-hand insight into real-world challenges, and that's why I'm here today. But before I go and participate in the presentation, I just want to make it clear the views and opinions I will share today are my own. They do not represent the views, positions, or opinions of my employer or any organization that I'm associated with or any third-party entities. I'm speaking here in my own personal capacity, and everything I present today is intended for informational and educational purposes. Just to reiterate and reemphasize what Graeme mentioned, I also an educator. I'm PCB trainer, so whatever I say today should not be treated a legal advice nor professional or business advice, please. Thank you. Graeme, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Tipind. And yeah, that last point about legal advice is very good, because obviously here we are talking about essentially a piece of legislation, and we'll explain what we're going to do in terms of the agenda. Is for those of you who are not so familiar with NIS 2, we're just going to give you a brief overview of what it's all about. We're then going to talk about, and of course, who it applies to and how we work that out. We'll then talk about a little bit of an implementation approach, or logical way in which you could approach implementing all the components, if you like, you need to have in an organization to become compliant with NIS 2. And I'll talk you through that, and then with Deepinder, we'll certainly talk through some of the existing challenges and solutions. I think some of the experience, Deepinder, you were speaking about earlier, will certainly be referring back to that, and then talking about where we go from here. There will be a questions and answers session at the end as well. So if you do have any questions at all as we go through this, please post them in the chat function. Our moderator at the end will pull out as many questions as possible that we'll try and answer. If there are more questions than time allows, please don't worry, we will answer questions offline as well. So yeah, anything at all, please feel free to ask. So it's probably a good idea though to start with what NIS 2 is. But before we talk about NIS 2, it might be worth taking a step back a few years in time, because there is already, or prior to NIS 2, a directive, dropping the 2, called the NIS Directive, or the Network and Information Security Directive. And the aim of that particular directive from the EU, so I think the first thing that I should start off by explaining here is a directive at European Union level is basically a special type of legislation that the European Union create, which essentially directs, hence the term directive, the member states, that is to say the countries that are a member of the EU, and it gives them direction on how to create their own local legislation, which hopefully would be similar in its principles across the board. So going back a number of years, that we had the launch of the NIS directive, and the idea was what the EU wanted to achieve was across EU member states, they wanted what they called critical sectors to have a standardized level of cybersecurity. There's obviously a growing concern about the state of security across the union, and there's two kind of aims behind these directives. One is to ensure sort of a consistent approach across the union, sort of a minimum baseline level of security, if you like. But the other is to allow cooperation. If there's similar legislation, it allows those organisations that are subject to this legislation to work together, to exchange information and so forth. And one of the things they did create at the time was what was called the CISA, so Computer Security Incident Response Team Network. So you now see a standardised approach across the union. So initially, though, the original NIS 2 directive was limited to what we would call critical sector organisations. So these would be things like electricity and power, to some degree, finance, transportation, services along those lines, as well as digital service providers. Now, since that point in time, there's been further work done, and essentially we are at the point now where we see the launch of the NIS 2 directive. So the NIS 2 directive, of course, replaces the directive that I was speaking about a moment ago. Just in terms, very, very briefly, in terms of where we are. So it was published at the back end of 2022. Essentially came into force in January 2023, and what that means is then that nation states, or members of the European Union, have a certain time window to what we call transposition that directive into local legislation. So this means, just for argument's sake, if I went to France or the Netherlands or Germany, they would all have their own local law that's been transitioned from the NIS 2 directive. Now, without getting too hung up on details, it is worth me pointing out at this stage that some member states have actually transpositioned this directive into local legislation. So for example, in Belgium, this is now local law. Some other countries within the European Union have not yet done this, they've not achieved the deadline, and there is sort of ongoing work around that. So I think that's an important point to call out. We'll get into in a moment who it's applicable to, because it's those who are caught up under NIS 1, if you want to call it that, are still subject to this. But as I'll talk about in a moment, the scope of NIS 2 has broadened quite significantly. The main thing about the directive as well is what they're wanting to do is to make sure that organisations that are in scope have what they would call adequate technical measures to deal with security incidents. There are also, as we'll see in a few minutes, some very specific mandatory reporting requirements. So one thing that's important to note is each EU member state is required to have what we call a national authority or a competent authority. And in the event of an incident, it's the competent authority who we would report to. So there is some background on here, but I think what I'd like to get into is essentially who does this apply to? Now this slide here obviously is quite high level, and I think this is a thing I know you're going to talk about a bit, Deepinder, aren't you, in a bit more depth later on in the presentation. But within the actual NIS 2 directive text, there is two annexes, Annex 1 and Annex 2, which talks in much more depth about some of the sectors. And as I say, Deepinder's going to delve into this in a bit more depth shortly. But if we just at this moment in time talk at a very broad level, what we're saying is that these sectors that you see mentioned on the slide here are what the EU would consider under the directive sectors of high criticality. Because what we're trying to achieve here is to ensure that the sectors on which society depends, this is what really the focus of NIS 2 is, that we have a confidence in their, I guess, cybersecurity, their cyber resilience. So we're looking at sectors which, if disrupted, through a cyber attack or some kind of system outage, etc., if disrupted, would have a significant impact on society at large. So it's quite broad in terms of what type of organisations would be considered to be highly critical. And just to give you an understanding or a bit of an elaboration on that, I said earlier on that the scope had sort of increased. So on what you see on the slide here is the original NIS, if you like, the NIS 1, if you want to call it that. Some of the sectors on there were certainly complying or required to comply with that. Now you can see that what we consider to be critical sectors is certainly broadened out. We can see in there, for example, postal services, waste management, certain aspects of manufacturing. Obviously, a very, very big one. A lot of organisations I work with, digital providers. So those things include things like social media platforms, online marketplaces, hosting providers, etc. So in terms of the potential organisations that might be required to comply with NIS 2, that's broadened. Now, we'll talk more about this a bit later, but the thing I always point out to people is even if you're looking at this slide and saying, well, we're not on there, therefore this doesn't apply to us, it still can in a number of ways. So first of all, potentially, if you're a supplier to one of these organisations, although the NIS 2 legislation, the directive may not apply directly to your organisation, you may still be caught up in the need to improve your security posture in order to do business with these organisations. Because one of the big pillars in NIS 2 is about supply chain security. So I think that's an important point as well. Also, anybody who says, well, we are not an EU business, we operate outside of the European Union. Well, the one very important point is if you're in these fields and you're delivering these services into the European Union, even if you're a non-EU business, then there's still a requirement to have a local representative and still a requirement to adhere to the provisions of NIS 2, or more to the point, the provisions of the local legislation that's been transpositioned across. But before I go any further, I think it might be worth sorry, Deepinder, you might want to sort of comment on this, because I know you had some remarks earlier on about scope and who's in and out of scope and so forth. So happy for you to add your thoughts to what I'm saying here.
Yes, certainly, Graeme. I will cover that challenge later on as well. But you have rightly pointed out that it's also you may be indirectly in scope if you are providing services to these critical suppliers. Also, to some extent, national competent authorities also have liberty to include some of the sectors in essential or important, or move important to essential category, depending upon the risk exposure in their own geography. So, that's something to consider. So, NIS2, as you said, rightly pointed out, Graeme, that it's a baseline. You have to then consult with the national competent authorities to make sure you are doing the right classification, or you are following the right classification in the member state you're operating.
Brilliant, thank you. Excellent stuff. So just also to say, before we talk about a few things about transposition and so forth, the big change really, despite as well as the scope, which we've talked about, between NIS and NIS2, is that NIS2, I would say, promotes a much more proactive approach. So it has this concept within it called the all hazards risk approach. So it's not just simply a case of quickly knocking together an information security risk assessment. There's a requirement to really proactively try and understand your risk from multiple perspectives. There is a requirement to proactively look for threats, to conduct system monitoring, to gather threat intelligence. So it's not about waiting for an incident to happen and how you respond. They actually want organisations to be what we would call on the front foot when it comes to this. And there is, as we'll get to shortly, a set of requirements for reporting incidents, and there's some quite stringent requirements about, depending on the incident, making an initial report within 24 hours and an update within 72 through what we call the national competent authorities. Now, with that in mind, something I just wanted to quickly, I sort of mentioned it a few moments ago. So because this is a directive, as I've already said, which the European Commission has put together, it's then down to the member states to take that directive and essentially codify it in local law. It's what we call transposition. And the theory was that member states were meant to transpose this legislation before sort of October 2024. Some have, but there's quite a few who hasn't. And some of them are making progress, some more than others. I was reading about this a little bit recently, and what the European Commission have done, essentially, for those member states that haven't yet taken action, they've already started to write to those member states to say, you have these obligations. That could be followed by something called a reasoned opinion, which is where the European Commission tell the member states that they, in their belief, they're failing to fulfill their obligations, and giving them a 2-month window to reply. And there's talk about those reasoned opinions being sent in due course. All of this to say, from our point of view, stepping outside the complexity of the EU, depending on where we're operating in the European Union, we could be in a country that has already transpositioned the legislation, and things are very clear, something like Belgium, for example, or you could be in another EU member state where things are still a little bit up in the air. So obviously what we can talk about in this webinar, and often when I teach the NIS2 lead implementer course, which is a PCB course on all of this, we always try and sort of present it from a principles perspective, but always with that caveat that there will be local nuances to that, which we'll discuss a little bit when we get into the challenges section very shortly. So something important then, so we'll get on to in a moment the roadmap, because I'm sure a lot of you here want to know, well, okay, this is all well and good, but how does it apply to me, and what do we do to ensure that we're doing all the things that NIS2 expects of us? And I will get there, but before that, there is some important definitions that everybody needs to be familiar with. So not only do we need to work out as an entity whether we are in one of those sectors that we were talking about earlier on, We also need to work out whether we would be considered to be either an essential or important entity according to NIS 2. So I won't read these out line for line. You can quickly sort of read through some of these, but essentially an essential entity is considered as a large organization in what NIS 2 would call highly critical sector. So in Annex 1 of the directive at the bottom, there's a list of critical sectors. So keeping it very simple for now, but if you fell into that annex, you have more than 250 employees, or a turnover over above 50 million euros, or the balance sheet of at least 43 million euros, whichever of those boxes you tick, you would be considered as an essential entity. We then have, as you can see, important entities, and that's where we're looking at either Annex 1 and or Annex 2 of the directive. And again, this depends on your size as to whether you're what's called a medium-sized employee, a medium-sized enterprise in this case. It's important to note and work out as part of your planning whether you're an essential or an important entity, because there are specific requirements that go along with that, which we'll come to shortly. It's also just to say as well, there is this additional terminology we have, which is called critical entities. Now, you won't find in the annex a heading called critical entities, but what we mean by critical entities is that at the member state level, a public, or so in other words, your government run or private entity, so a private entity, can be determined by the member state as being what we call a critical entity. So even if you're a small business, if you're doing something super critical, let's say you're involved in electricity distribution, maybe you're a critical component in the national grid, for argument's sake, this is just an example, in your particular country, then your competent authority could deem your organization to be a critical entity. And in that case, there are additional requirements, and you would also be part of something here called the Critical Entities Resilience Group, which is very focused on those very specific entities. So again, one of the starting points on your journey to NIS 2 compliance is to really work out which of these areas you fall into, and as I think Deepinder will talk about shortly, having conversations with your national competent authority as well. We put this in just for additional information because the directive does refer to things like micro, small and medium-sized businesses. So I won't take your time of reading this criteria out. We put it in the slide deck because we thought it would be helpful, because as you kind of work your way through the directive, again, knowing where you sit is pretty important. So what I would like to do, and this will kind of lead us on to where we go through the rest of the discussion here to some degree, is to talk about the strategic approach. So this is a relatively high level view here, a bit of a helicopter view at the moment, but let's just imagine you are tasked in your organization, your senior management are interested in NIS 2. We want to understand an approach to actually implementing and meeting the various requirements that exist. There are a few things, of course, we would recommend you do. Well, the first one I've already mentioned, of course, is working out, based on what you do, based on the service delivery you have, do we actually think NIS 2 applies? And if so, what type of entity are you? Are you a critical entity? And so forth, based on your size, based on the criteria we've given you. Now, assuming the answer to that is yes, and for the rest of this discussion, we'll assume the answer is yes, it would be a good idea, first of all, to design what we call a scope. And the scope would describe, well, what parts of your organization fall into scope. So just to be absolutely clear, what sort of service delivery are you doing? What key systems, locations, suppliers, etc., should be focused upon when we focus on our security efforts. Of course, as well as that, we want to have a good understanding of what our current security posture looks like. Now, when we look in NIS 2, there's quite a lot of things, of course. It's a very big piece of legislation. However, there are some what I would call key pillars in there. Those key pillars focus around things like governance. So have we got proper top management oversight of the security risk and security effort, top management taking a leadership role when it comes to cybersecurity. Risk management, that all hazards approach I mentioned a little bit earlier on. So do we have a robust, proactive risk management approach? Do we really understand our cybersecurity risk? Cybersecurity controls. So here I can be talking about both technical and organizational controls, and incident detection and response. So what I'm saying is here is a good idea to have a review of all of these areas and say how well are we doing in each of these areas. Now there is, with NIS2, also depending on what sector you're in, something called implementing guidance, and that implementing guidance certainly provides additional context for some of these. Now, with that in mind, if you've got a good picture of what your cybersecurity landscape looks like, then we can talk about saying, okay, and if we understand what our risk looks like, this is where then we can move into defining very clear security objectives. What are we trying to achieve? Which of these areas need to perhaps improve? What particular risks do we need to tackle? And alongside that, of course, I want to make sure, where I've said establish suitable governance and oversight, because NIS2 is very big on that top management perspective, we want to be thinking here about our reporting lines, how do we feed to top management on what our cybersecurity risk looks like, how do we ensure we've got ongoing buy-in and support from the top management, a level of independence, so maybe we've got independent audits of our security mechanisms taking place, which is kind of the next line down, having appropriate assurance processes, and ensuring over time that those activities are actually happening long term. One of the things we want to avoid is having in inverted commas, a compliance project and everybody rushing around and implementing policy and procedure and so forth, and then things grinding to a halt. What we've got to accept, the organisation needs to accept that NIS2 compliance, in whatever form it looks like, is an ongoing thing, and we want to ensure that compliance becomes normalised. And by normalised, I mean that the organisation essentially practice some of these things, without question. Essentially, it becomes part of what we do. Now, obviously, on this slide, we've stopped short of giving you a list of controls and so forth, because the key point here is the NIS2 directive is exactly that. It's a directive to EU member states. It does include implementation guidance, but what it isn't is a checklist. So I can't stand here and say, implement your firewall like this, or configure Amazon AWS like that, and there you'll be compliant, because a lot of it comes down to really understanding your risk landscape, which I think we're going to talk about in a moment when we talk about some of the challenges. But before I hand over in a moment to Deepinder to dig a bit deeper on some of those challenges and other such things, the final thing I was going to say is the NIS2 directive, we can take an approach to implementing this in an orderly and logical manner. Now, if you've already been through the PECB NIS2 Lead Implementer training course, obviously you might recognize this picture here. If you haven't, and you do come onto the course, then this is how we logically try and explain the implementation to you. So essentially what we try and do is say, look, yes, it's a piece of legislation, but we can approach its implementation in a similar way to many other cybersecurity frameworks or legal requirements. And typically what we do at PCB, we try to break this down a little bit, and following what's called the Deming cycle, which you might be familiar with, the plan, do, check out cycle, which is named after a management consultant named Graeme Parker. And what he basically says at a very high level is, okay, well, before we implement anything, we're going to spend a certain amount of time planning. So when we think about planning, that's a lot of the stuff I've just talked about a moment ago. We're going to work out how NIS2 applies to us. We're going to make sure we understand our organisation well, understand the other laws and regulations that apply, the type of risk we might face, ensure we've set up our governance structure, put the right people in the right places with the right skills, and understood our risks, essentially. And with that in mind, then we can move to doing something. We can implement our cybersecurity controls. We can implement our supply chain security to make sure our suppliers are meeting our requirements. We can set up that incident management, crisis management, and business continuity capability. We can ensure that people are trained properly and are aware of what they're required to do. And of course, the check part is we can actually test our security controls through what we call threat-led penetration testing, for example. That's one of the key things that's talked about within this too. We can you conduct audits, reviews, and so forth to ensure that what we've put in place is working effectively, and hopefully to learn and improve. So you'll actually see, if you go through this, the logic, it's not the same, let me be clear. I'm not arguing that NIS 2 is the same as any other directive or framework or standard, but the logic of implementation can be very, very similar in terms of the thought process. So this almost gives you the roadmap. But whilst this is good and quite high, it's sort of quite high level view, I think it does make sense to sort of dig a little bit deeper, if you like, and maybe get into some of the real world challenges that people have faced. And I know in this section, I'm not deep into, you've got quite a few things I think you were going to talk about here. So firstly, I'm happy for you. Do you want to add any comments on what I've just said, or shall we dive into this and continue the discussion?
Graeme, actually, you have provided a very good foundation for all the arguments and challenges I'm going to talk about. So it's, I think it's amazing how you covered most of the complex, topics related to NIS 2, and really appreciate that. So thank you very much. I just want to do a time check with Yetmir. Yetmir, how much time do I have? Just want to make sure.
You can take 20 minutes, but go slowly if needed. We will make some time.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Graeme. So, you have certainly understood. Before we move to the next slide, I just want to cover. So, Graeme has provided a very good foundation, and one of the things that you may have noticed is that NIS 2 directive was meant to harmonize cybersecurity expectations across the EU. But what we are actually seeing is a patchwork of interpretation, sector level confusion, and a whole lot of organizations asking the same questions. Are we essential or important? What standard should we use? Do we really need to have board level accountability from day one? Where do we start? These are not minor hurdles. These are key barriers. One that can slow you down, slow down your compliance effort, delay risk reduction, and eat up budgets and cause cost overruns. But there's a good news. There are solutions, right? So we will cover these challenges one by one. And the solutions don't always start with new tools or technology, I must say. They start with clarity at board level and engagement with national competent authorities to seek their alignment. So in next few minutes, I'm going to unpack the biggest challenges we are seeing, and more importantly, we will walk through how to deal with those challenges. Now, let's try to get and cut through the complexity we see, organization facing. So thank you very much, Graeme, for moving to the slide. So let's start with, one of the biggest challenge we are seeing, right, which is causing a lot of confusion out there in the field, and that is this deceptively simple question: are we an essential or important entity under NIS 2? It sounds like technicality, right? But in practice, this classification determines everything from how you are supervised to how much level of effort will go into achieving compliance. So these are the things that you have to consider. Why it is confusing, you may ask? Well, you would think the director would make it crystal clear. And Graeme talked about the criteria. The size is one. The risk factor is another one. And also there's a leeway for member state to designate you as critical entity, as Graeme mentioned. But it's So it becomes very complex as you start to unravel and follow through this. So it opens up the door to interpretation, and with the interpretation comes the inconsistency. A real-world example, say you are a medium-sized cloud services firm, you host platforms for healthcare, maybe even bank or other sectors. You've got, say, 280 staff, operates in 3 EU countries, pretty standard medium market operation, right? Now, are you essential or are you important? How you classify yourself? And NIS 2 infrastructure, which is part of critical supply. Is critical to the functionality of society or a member state or their ecosystem. You may be classified essential. And if you imagine if your business touches multiple sectors, right, lines start to blur. And add to that, as I said, varying national definition. Every member state has flexibility and empowerment to add more industries to Annex 1 based on criticality. If a member state has only one supplier of baking products, food products, or even waste treatment plant, then it's likely that these will be classified as essential rather than important. So again, key point, Graeme mentioned earlier, and I will re-emphasize it, talk to your national competent authority. Look at your national implementation or transposition of national NIS 2 directive. So consult your local act. And one thing why it is important is that it's not just semantics. If you are essential, you will be subjected to proactive supervisions. That means proactive audits, spot checks, higher risk of enforcement. If you are important, it is mostly reactive, unless something goes wrong. So if you misclassify yourself, it's a rare case, but if you consult a national competent authority, it's unlikely that will happen. But if you classify yourself, think you are essential, you may end up overspending and overprotecting, right? Putting in more effort than required. So, what can organization do? Carry out thorough sectoral mapping if you operate in several sectors. Review your size and impact using thresholds in Article 2. But because Article 2 is also important, I've seen most of the companies, organizations focusing on Article 3, but Article 2 is also important. And engage very early with your national competent authority, right? And I would suggest engage with a very good consulting firm, right? But main thing is alignment with national competent authority, right? So next slide, please. So once you have classified yourself, you understand whether you're essential or important entity. Next thing is most of the time we come across this is where do we start, right? And that's fair question, because for companies that were not subject to this one or NIS, it's not just an update. It is an entry into whole new regulatory ecosystem or landscape. The first time shock. So let's walk through what it looks like. You are a manufacturer or logistic platform or medium-size managed service provider. Suddenly you are getting flagged as an essential entity under NIS 2. No prior cybersecurity compliance obligation, no formal governance structure, no internal CISA, no board level cyber reporting, and maybe there's not even dedicated security team. And now you're being told to stand up to the governance structure whereby management bodies of essential and important entities not only approve cybersecurity measures, as Graeme earlier mentioned, which are actually enshrined in Article 21 and 20 as well, but are expected to oversee its implementation. That's not just technical project. That is a governance shift, a cultural shift, and a resource challenge, all rolled into one. So where do you start? And here's where I suggest organizations to start, especially if you are new to this space. Start with awareness at top. And I really mean awareness at the top. If your leadership does not know or understand what NIS2 is, what it means, you are already off course. Article 20 makes it very clear, crystal clear. The management body is accountable. So here's the first move I recommend to any organization coming under NIS2. Schedule that board briefing, educate your C-suite, board, get them behind the why before you worry about what and how. Because if your board is on board, everything, excuse the pun, everything else from resources to prioritization becomes so much easier. And another thing is, will any cybersecurity training will do for board? Do you go with an internal slide deck, a generic course, a self-paced video? Well, here's the answer. Don't guess. Don't guess. Check with your local national competent authority, because in some member states, we are seeing a clear position. Only accredited or approved training will be accepted, nothing else. So, again, if you're looking for board awareness and their training, check with your national competent authority. And if you want to get it right and you want to start at the right footing, right? Check which kind of training is built to. And this is just beginning. Once leadership is aware and trained, you will have their support. You will have their buy-in. You have won half the battle, because half the battle we see in cybersecurity, most of CISO come to us is, how do we convince the board? And that is just a start. So next slide, please. And so making your board aware and get them trained is only part of the equation. You need to also ascertain the baseline. Graeme mentioned, where are we today? Run a gap analysis against all the requirements, especially in the Article 21. Ask yourself, do we have a formal risk management process? Do we have inventory of assets? Do we know our critical assets? Can we detect and report incident within 24 hours, as Graeme mentioned? How well we cover supply chains, supply chain risk. What about the basic cyber hygiene? Is our IAM is good? Is patching program up to date? You would be amazed how much you already have and we're still missing. Another thing is, you don't need a perfect program on day one. You have to have clear roadmap objectives, but that can change. But main thing is to have ownership and visibility and clear roadmap. And start with that. And then document every step, because the documentation becomes your evidence for compliance later on. Get ready for incident reporting. That is one non-negotiable requirement. Within 24 hours of becoming aware of significant incident, you need to file an early warning with National CSIRT. Do you know who the National CSIRT is? If you have no tools, no processes, no clearly defined format to use, because you have to report it in a certain format. So that's where the breakdown happens. So identify your reporting chain now, test it, document it, practice it. And NIS2 is not a checklist. Graeme also mentioned it. It is a reframing of cyber risk as a business risk, not just an IT problem. So when people ask, where do we start? My answer is this. Start with understanding this is not a compliance sprint. It is a strategic shift. And it begins with clarity, leadership, and accountability. Start small, start early, but must more importantly start with intent. Now, before I move to the next slide, I want to pause and share a real world example, because this one hits home for a lot of organizations. Now, we were working with a client, medium-sized organization that had engaged a local boutique consulting firm. They had been collaborating with them for 6 months. They were confident. They were totally confident that their asset and risk management processes are rock solid. But here's what they did not know. Their local national competent authority had specific requirements around classification of critical assets. Not just classification. The NCA, or National Competent Authority, required a formal approval of those critical assets. So suddenly, what they thought was done and dusted was not. This created confusion, rework across the risk assessment, revalidation of their impact levels, and updates to their statement of applicability. And all of it could have been avoided. Here's the takeaway. Don't just rely on NIS2 directive text. That is the baseline, as Graeme mentioned. You must consult the local act of transposition because that's where the real implementation rules live. Your compliance depends not just on good practices, but on understanding your local NCA's expectations. So before you finalize your SLS, for example, or risk strategy, check with your national rules. Talk to your national competent authority because in NIS2, exemptions can be expensive. Next slide, please. Thank you, Graeme. So here's the big one we get in nearly every workshop, CISO boardroom briefing, right? Which standard shall we use to achieve NIS2 compliance? ISO 27001, NIS CSF, NIS SP 853, CIS top 20, top 18 now. But here's the truth. None of them are mandated, but all of them are useful. NIS2 is outcome focused. It does not prescribe a particular standard. It tells you what must be achieved, but not exactly how. So the real question is not which one. It is how do you use these standards to demonstrate that you are meeting these two outcomes? You will likely need a map and combine them. You know, what I mean is do a mapping between them. If you are using already using a standard, use it and cross map to any guidelines your national competent authorities have provided. And key trick here is you need to align your framework, whatever it is, to what your NCA expects. Now here is where things get really interesting. Because while NIS2 sets a European-wide baseline, every member state is taking slightly different approach to operationalize it. And let's take example of Belgium and Finland, right? So both are actively implementing this too, but their guidance expectations and assurance models are slightly different. In Belgium, the National Cybersecurity Center has introduced something called CIFMAN. It is based on NIST cybersecurity framework, but you can also use ISO 27001 as foundation. Belgium classifies entities and expects assurance levels of basic, essential and important. And your ISO 27000 scope and state of applicability can be submitted for validation. Now let's talk about Finland. If you're operating in Finland, you will want to review the guidance from Traficom, which is Finnish Transport and Communication Agency. They have released in-depth cross-reference table, and it is incredibly detailed. This table links together the Finnish Cybersecurity Act, the Act on Information Management in Public Administration, the NIS2 directive, and a long list of relevant standards that includes ISO 27001, 27005, 27035, 28000, IEC 62443, NIST cybersecurity framework, and the public sector specific JLCRI. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. And even the Cybermeter 2. So if you are in Finland, it's not just about picking a framework, it's about mapping to a national ecosystem of requirements. And just to give you, hot off the press news, the National Cybersecurity Center of Ireland has also adopted CIFMAN that was developed by Cybersecurity Center for Belgium. They have issued a risk management methods building on CIFMAN to guide how entities assess and demonstrate compliance. So what's the point here? The point I'm trying to make is even though NIS2 is a single directive, your path to compliance depends on where you operate. The standard you choose, ISO 27000 or NIS CSF or others, must align with the national competent authority expectations and your sector. and the assurance level required. So don't just choose a standard in isolation. Start with your local national competent authority framework, and from there build a program that's not just compliant, but resilient, aligned, and auditable. Next slide, please. So here's another question I get a lot. Will our existing ISO 27000 certification suffice for this too? And close on here is another question. Will our plan to achieve ISO 27000 certification help us comply with this too? So let's take them one by one. First, will your existing ISO 27001 certification suffice? It's a great start. It shows intent. It shows maturity. It shows that you already have management board in place, management oversight in place, but it may not suffice because NIS 2 has a broader expectation. The current scope of existing ISO 27000 may not fully cover your entire operation. And under NIS 2, your scope must include entire entity, not just IT, not just one site or business unit, all operations end to end. So the current certification may fall short and might need to be validated or expanded. Second question, if we are planning to get an ISO 27001 certification, will that help? Yes, it definitely helps as a strong foundational framework. It brings discipline, controls, and risk thinking, but on its own, it won't automatically make you NIS 2 compliance. If you are in a member state where NCA expects a list of critical assets to be approved, you may be required to submit it for approval. That's one required alone may trigger a revision of your risk assessment, updates to your impact levels, as I mentioned earlier, and a revised statement of applicability, and potentially new mitigations or controls. Now, even with ISO 27001 in place, and that is important, I highly recommend you engage your national competent authority. Why? Because their expectations may vary. Again, assumption can be very expensive in NIS 2. So let me give you an example before I finish. For example, if you are operating in Belgium, the Cybersecurity Center of Belgium provides a framework to determine what level of siphon assurance is required. Is it basic, medium, or high? Right? It's basic, essential, and important. This is based on your classification, entities classification, threats, and risk levels. Then Center Security for Belgium has already done a sector-wise risk assessment you can use. And you can also change it if you feel the risk is higher than what CCB has assessed. They even recommend submitting your ISO 27000 certification along with your statement of applicability for validation. And also, what I'm seeing, not me, but my team as well, all seeing, is that member states requiring audits by specifically approved audit firms called conformity assessment bodies. Now, conformity assessment in NIS 2 context, be it siphon or through ISO 27000, shall be performed by an accredited and authorized conformity assessment body. Again, taking an example of CCB, Cybersecurity Center of Belgium, it is also national accreditation body for conformity assessment bodies, and they basically accredit who will assess the compliance of firms. And these certification conformity assessment bodies are accredited by assurance level. You cannot pick and choose any auditor off the shelf, right? If you depending on the level of assurance required, you may have to select certain certification conformity assessment bodies, right? I know a particular country in my particular member state where they have specified which audit firm will do basic, which audit firm will do essential, which audit firm will do important. So again, you have to basically look at your national guidance. And if you are operate in a multi-sector, if your company, your organization is big and operate in multi-sector, in multi-sectors or multiple sectors, go for highest level of assurance required by any of your sectors, because when it comes to NIS 2, your compliance posture must reflect your most critical exposure. So in a nutshell, if you have ISO 27001 certification or planning to do it, it's a good, powerful tool. But for NIS2 compliant, it demands a broader view, deeper engagement, and alignment with national expectations. Right? ISO 27000 standard gives you a very good structure, very good place to start with, but NIS2 demands assurance. And this brings me to the end of the conversation, this presentation. I hope I've covered most of the challenges. If I'm not, please, you will have question answer sessions. Probably will not be sufficient time to answer all questions, but submit them and we can, provide the answers. But before, I leave you, something I want to, leave you with today. And again, just remember, NIS2 is not just another compliance regulation. It is a shift from seeing cybersecurity as a back office function to recognizing it as a board level, risk-based operational priority. And yes, the challenges I've talked about are real. Varying or nuances in national interpretations, ambiguity around entity classification, new accountability placed on security on management, and confusing buffet of frameworks and standards that are available to us, and limited time to build incident response capability that actually work. But the solution, they are well within our reach. If we start with intent, get the board on board, excuse my pun against, clarify your classification early, understand your local national competent authorities' expectations, map your current state, use standards that match your risk and scope. And if you're familiar with something, use it. And above all, start documenting your journey now. And this is not, as Graeme mentioned earlier, this is not sprint to tick checkboxes. It is a strategic reset of how we manage our digital risk in Europe. And someone asks you, where do we start with NIS2? You can always say, we can start with clarity, we can start with leadership, and we will have to start now. Thank you very much, Graeme. I think probably slightly more time than anticipated.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Deepinder. I think that last point was an excellent one, because it just reminded me, I was in a meeting literally 2 weeks ago where somebody made the remark that NIS2 is simply ISO 27001, and that's a myth that's been widely propagated. So I think that last point was really, really important to call out. So I don't know, Jetmir, do you want to jump in here firstly with questions and answers if we've got time for that, or I'll let you tell us how you'd like to play this here?
Yeah, before we go to the Q&A session, I'd like to leave you with something valuable for your ongoing professional development. PCB Skills is our on-demand learning platform created to help professionals like you stay ahead with flexible, bite-sized training capsules. Whether you're building expertise in cybersecurity, ISO standards, data privacy, or leadership, PCB Skills give you access to more than 3,000 courses anytime, anywhere. The platform is designed for practical learning. The capsules are short, focused modules that fit into your busy schedule, and you can start learning immediately, and as well as track your progress. On top of that, you can earn CPD points and attestations, and even get certified. If today's webinar inspired you to deepen your knowledge, I highly recommend exploring PCB Skills. It's perfect for individuals looking to upskill, stay compliant, or explore new domains in information security, risk management, and beyond. If you are interested on PCB Skills, please reach out to marketing.skills@pcb.com. I will send this email on the chat for all of you to have. If you are interested on PCB Skills, feel free to reach out to this email to book a meeting or explore the catalog. No extra fees after registration, just one subscription, full access. Now we'll move on to the Q&A session. We had a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to cover them all, but I'll start with the first one. It says UK NIS regulation 2018 does not include all NIS2 components. Does it mean that we have to include components of ISO 27001 2022, NCSC cyber assessment framework, NIST, CSF, SOC 2, etc.? Or should we just ensure compliance with NIS 2, even though it is not applicable to the UK?
Yeah, so maybe if that's all right for me to jump in, because I was literally reading a bit about this morning. So yeah, so what's happening in the UK, the position at the moment, so you're absolutely right, we had the NIS 2018 adopted, if you like. The government right now is passing through Parliament what's called the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. You can, if you Google that, you'll actually find the paper on this, which lays out its intent. And in that paper, it does explain that the intent is to have something here in the UK that would be similar to NIS 2. It's obviously not going to be word for word the same, but there is an appetite to align our legislation with NIS 2. My understanding is obviously it's got to work its way through Parliament. We would expect the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill to become legislation, as far as I understand it, at some point next year. So the first point is that gap is going to be plugged in UK legislation. Obviously, if you're a UK organisation selling into the European Union, then you still need to follow all the provisions of NIS 2. One of the requirements is that you will need to have a representative within one of the EU member states registered with with access to the national competent authority. So I would say you still need to look at NIS 2 if you're selling into the European Union, but at the same time, keep your eye on what's happening with the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, because that's going to become very relevant here in the next year or so. Deepinder, if you want to add to that point.
No, I mean, I think you covered it very well, Graeme. Another thing is, if you are one of the lucky ones where you operate in a membership that still has a way to go to transposition to NIS 2, you may want to wait, for national competent authority in that member state. But otherwise, your view is totally valid, Graeme. Nothing much to add on that. But I think the upcoming regulation is there to reset, realign UK with NIS 2 and also DORA, because that's also covered another act that is coming, which is already in place in EU about digital virtual resilience for financial entities. So that's another reason for government to put this new bill through.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. Yeah, we had another question. Says, how do NIS 2 and DORA overlap or complement one another with regard to banking operators? Sorry.
So, Graeme, I may take it. So luckily, I've done both PECB and NIS 2 and DORA lead implementer course, and that certainly was quite helpful. So going back to your question, there is a lex special category where DORA requirements, sector-specific requirements, actually take precedence over NIS 2. So, in case of DORA, you have a European Supervisory Board, depending upon whether you are a pension regulator or you are banking, so you have supervisory authorities. But requirements of DORA will, supersede NIS 2 requirements. So that's why you have lex special category. Graeme, anything to add?
Yeah, I think no, that's absolutely spot on. I think, and just to point out the slight difference as well, isn't it? Because obviously NIS 2 is a directive, meaning there'll be transposed versions of it in each EU member state, whereas a DORA, being an act or a regulation, is unified across the EU member states as well. So that's just a slight nuance to be aware of, I guess.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we had allocated for the Q&A session, but don't worry, as the panelists said, all of the unanswered questions will be addressed and published in the next edition of the PCB magazine, so be sure to subscribe to stay informed and get answers to your questions. Now, once again, just a quick reminder before we finish the session, the recording of this webinar, along with the presentation slides, will be available on our website and YouTube channel. And an attestation of webinar completion will be issued within a week to all participants who attended at least 60% of the live session. Thank you all for your time and engagement today, and a very special thank you to Graeme and Deep for delivering such an insightful session. We hope to see you again at our upcoming webinars. Take care and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Graeme, for the opportunity.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.